Okay. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today for the webinar, How to Apply to the USDOT's Reconnecting Communities and Neighborhoods Grant Program. We are so happy to have you here with us. Today's webinar is presented by the Transportation Equity Caucus, a diverse coalition of organizations promoting policies that ensure access, mobility, and opportunity for all. We work collaboratively to transform the transportation systems in Black, Indigenous, and communities of color, low-income communities, and other marginalized communities through research, advocacy, and communication strategies. My name is Marisa Jones, and I'm the Policy and Partnerships Director at Safe Routes Partnership, a national nonprofit that works to create safe, convenient, and equitable opportunities for kids and people of all ages to walk and roll to school and throughout their communities. And we are a member of the Transportation Equity Caucus. I am so pleased to be moderating today's panel. So the purpose of today's webinar is to serve as an informal space for nonprofits, local governments, and other stakeholders to ask questions about what it takes to apply for the Reconnecting Communities and Neighborhood program. Our goal with this webinar is to really build the capacity and confidence of you, participants, and potential applicants to pursue these funds. To that end, we have a great panel assembled today, comprised of people who have successfully applied for and won these grants, consultants that have prepared applications to these and federal transportation programs, and experts in housing and the intersection between transportation and housing. And housing is a really key partner in the Reconnecting Communities and Neighborhood program. If you'll indulge me, I'd like to quickly introduce our speakers. Cody Brandt is a member of one of the 4 teams that won Reconnecting Communities program planning funds in the first round of the program last year. He has a master in real estate from Georgetown University, where his final project, he wrote a paper called Promoting Economic Development Through Removing Freeways that was really focused on Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is where the project that he and his coalition applied for. He has also worked in the commercial real estate industry for the past 10 years. Spencer Finch is an engineer with over 2 decades of experience in both the consulting and public nonprofit sectors. He focuses on environmental engineering and sustainable infrastructure and provides strategic guidance to help communities plan and design healthy, active transportation networks. Spencer specializes in grant writing and grant management, resiliency planning and retrofitting, and sustainability programs. Andy Clark is the Director of Strategy at Tool Design, where he helps state and local clients across the country tackle their most difficult transportation challenges. Prior to Tool Design, Andy served for 12 years as the president of the League of American Bicyclists, as executive director of the Association of Pedestrian and Bicycle Professionals, and has also been the Secretary General of the European Cyclist Federation. And David Wheaton is the Economic Justice, Law, and Policy Fellow at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Prior to joining the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, David was the Advocacy Director at Texas Housers and the staff attorney at the Promise of Justice Initiative Capital Appeals Project. He has a Juris Doctorate from Elon University Law School. So to level set today's expectations, we are not planning to do a deep dive into the Reconnecting Communities and Neighborhoods program. There are several webinars that have already done that, and we will provide links for you to watch those webinars if you have not already. What we really want to do today is focus on what it takes to build the partnerships, select compelling projects, tell your community story, and craft a winning application. That said, we know you might not have watched the webinars yet, so we're going to provide a really brief overview of the RCN program. And RCN is the acronym that we'll use for the Reconnecting Communities and Neighborhoods program. Next slide, please. So the Reconnecting Communities and Neighborhoods program is a federal discretionary grant run through USDOT. USDOT is the United States Department of Transportation. What does that mean? That means it is a nationwide competitive grant. And the Reconnecting Communities and Neighborhoods program combines two programs. And USDOT is welcoming applications that fit with either or both of these programs. Want to provide the quickest summary of these programs. So the Neighborhood Access and Equity program, which is one component of this, focuses on improving community connectivity, walkability, safety, and affordable transit access, especially in places where there are barriers to community connectivity or negative impacts to people or the environment, especially in communities that have been made vulnerable by historic and contemporary policies, funding, and infrastructure decisions. In NAE, Neighborhood Access and Equity, there's funding for both planning and capacity building activities, as well as capital construction. And this program is brand new, created from the Inflation Reduction Act. The second program, the second part of this program is called the Reconnecting Communities Pilot Program. This pilot program was created in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which is a 5-year transportation reauthorization, and it focuses specifically on removing, retrofitting, or mitigating existing man-made transportation facilities that create barriers to community connectivity, mobility, access, or economic development. It funds both capital construction and planning. Next slide, please. One of the reasons that we are having this quick turnaround, here we go through, here are the 3 types of projects that are eligible: capital construction, community planning, and regional planning. Okay, next slide, please. So one of the things that we really want to impress upon you, and one of the reasons that we're having this quick turnaround webinar, is that this year is really, really unique. This year, there's over $3 billion in funding available for these programs. And again, really intended to create community and neighborhood connectivity through improved walking, bicycling, and transit. We know, and the reason that this is a one-time investment is because it came through the Inflation Reduction Act. So I just want to say right now, like, we don't expect that there's going to be this level of money next year. So this is really the opportunity to apply for this huge amount of money. And we know that often communities, when there's a new program, they wait a year. They want to see, like, hey, what was successful? What worked? How does this program work? Normally, I think that's a fine strategy. And I really just want to encourage you that you should not sleep on this opportunity. There is not the opportunity guaranteed in the future. And similarly, we want to show Congress that there's demand, that nonprofits and local government, NPOs, that we want these types of programs. And in order to convey that message, we need there to be applications. But ultimately, what we really want is for the communities that you all live in, work in, and represent to build, improve, and repair connectivity that has either been missing or that was imposed on your community. And again, $3 billion can make a really big difference in that way. So with that background, I invite our panelists to come on video, and I want to really turn to the part of the program that you're all here for, which is hearing tips, experiences, and ideas for putting together, crafting really compelling, competitive applications. So thanks so much, David, Andy, Cody, and Spencer, for joining us today. We have a number of questions, and I'm so pleased to see that already questions are rolling into the Q&A. So for our participants, our attendees, we have a couple of questions that we will run through right now as a moderated Q&A. And then we know that you have questions because you've been emailing us them. And so please go ahead, and while we're beginning this conversation, go ahead and put those in the Q&A, and we will pivot from our moderated Q&A to Q&A from you all. So feel free to put those in anytime. So I want to start with Cody, because your group has successfully won a Reconnecting Communities pilot program. Can you give a really brief summary of what your group applied for and was awarded funding for?
Yeah, so we had applied for essentially the full 2 million, which was 1.6 in federal funds and $400,000 in local matching funds. The specific area that we're focusing on in our application was I-244, which is the highway that bisects the Greenwood neighborhood, which I'm sure the vast majority of people are probably pretty familiar with now. And so it was done with a community coalition of various nonprofits. We had one specific nonprofit that actually applied for it. And we did do this separately from even local government entities, which I won't get into very many details about that, but that's just kind of the very brief overview of it.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing that. So this is a question for any of you, and perhaps I don't know, whoever wants to start with answering it is fine. I'm curious if any of you can reflect on how you identify who should be the lead for the application and who are key partners to involve in the application process.
Well, first thing I'll do, Marisa, I'll go first. First thing I will do is confirm, and I talked to several of our staff who have written successful applications and have been working with communities, some of whom have put in applications like literally at the last minute. And they confirm, and I want to emphasize that it is critical to know who's in charge, like who is actually submitting the application, who's hitting the send button, who has the final say on different sections, different bits of the questions, so there's no either duplication or cross purposes during the application process. I'm guessing in most places it's an internal discussion, as Cody was suggesting, as to who takes the lead, who's involved, what the politics are. You all will know that better than we can suggest, but certainly something to be conscious of as the local political dynamics. And wherever possible, again, one of the other bits of advice I got from a colleague was, it's one thing to get agencies on board. It's also wise to make sure that the elected officials who are representing those agencies or those areas at least know and aren't surprised or blindsided by applications and are supportive, or at least not going to be difficult about it. So I'll add that to the conversation.
Thanks so much, Andy. Yeah.
I might add just a really quick thing that was particularly difficult with when we were applying is that as a nonprofit, if you're going to be the lead applicant, you have to have a UEI number, which can be time consuming to get. So if you're thinking about it, start that process now if you haven't done it. So that's just a lesson we learned in Tulsa. So.
Yeah, if I can
Cody,
jump in.
Thanks so much for saying that. Oh yeah, please go ahead, Spencer.
Yeah. Thanks, Marisa, and thanks, Cody. I think that's my cue here, right? Like, I think I'm lucky to have had the experience of both having applied for federal grants, right? Being on the nonprofit and public side of things, and also today helping many folks all across the country do applications, right? So on the admin side, what Cody just mentioned, right? Like there's all those nitty-gritty details that it's always helpful to have a consultant like Andy or I or others, right, to help you with. You have to have the UEI number, the sam.gov account set up, so all the nitty-gritty details if you've never applied for it before. If you're a larger municipal, county, or MPO, you regularly do those and you don't have to worry about that, right? So that's one of the nitty-gritty details. But I think big picture, just going back to the question, right? So who's in charge? You are in charge, right? Like you have the vision. Cody, you had the vision and wanted to make it happen. And I think the federal government is recognizing that and changing the guidance, and even more so now on RCN, right? So really encouraging nonprofits and others to apply for these fundings, these sources of funding, and making the application process quicker and easier, right? So you're not going to grants.gov anymore. It's easier to apply. You still need the UEI and the sam.gov, but you don't use grants.gov, right? There's a streamlined application process. What you do need, right, definitely, and I recommend whether you're doing it on your own or have a consultant helping you is to build the partnerships, right? A successful grant will only happen if you have a really strong partnership. So the more folks you can get on board, the better, right? If you can get your municipal government, county, state, your MPO is typically really, really key, right? Your metropolitan planning organization. They're really key to get on board, and they'll support you even if they don't want to be or can't be the official applicant, right? And then the final thing is, if you're going for capital funds, you definitely need the property owner, right? Like the DOT or the municipality, or whoever owns that facility, to be on board, because if not, you're not going to get the grant, right? So long story short, build the partnerships, really seek out, right? Folks, talk to everybody. They might not be behind you 100%, but the more support you get, even if it's 80%, right? It'll help you get across the finish line.
Perfect. I have two follow-up things. So one of them, Spencer, I just want to follow up on what you said and really reiterate to everyone here that if you're applying for capital grants, the facility owner, and you want to change the facility owner needs to be part of this. So just that's something that we learned from the last application, just really hammering that home. And Spencer, if I can just follow up on one thing, you talked about having the municipal government, county government, state, MPO as partners. How do you typically encourage a letter of support, or I guess anybody could talk about this. Like, how would you encourage potential applicants to demonstrate that they have these partnerships?
I'll try to be brief this time, and then David, Cody, Andy, you should jump in, right? But just a quick story. Like back in 2009, I was in Philly, and the Tiger Grant came out, right? And we had this vision of building the regional trail network around the metropolitan region. And nobody thought we could do it, but we kept building up and getting more partners involved. And we built a screening process to figure out which trail components, which greenways, which on-street facilities, right, we were eligible. And we took it to the MPO, and they supported us. And then we took them to the state DOTs, and they supported us, right? And eventually it created a circuit, 850 miles around metropolitan Philadelphia. So I think that's the key, right? You can do it just asking for letters of support, right? That's key. But then if you can build a stronger partnership and get folks involved in the process, I think that is important as well.
Great, thanks. We have a lot of questions about the UEI number, the unique identifier. So I just want to thank Sarah Klein from NRDC, who put some information into the chat about the process for getting that. And please note, it can take about a month to get, as Cody mentioned. And this application is due at the end of September. So no harm in starting to get that number now and then applying. So I just wanted to acknowledge that there were a lot of questions about that. So I want to shift to another question, because this is something that I'm seeing in the questions as well, is how do you decide whether to apply for a planning grant or a capital construction grant?
David, you want to go?
Yeah, I can go, but I think y'all are the experts on this part, so you can definitely go on this part.
I have some specific housing questions for David. I mean, David,
okay,
you can
all
hop
right.
in anytime, but I do have some specific questions for David in his area of expertise.
I just don't want to always be the one that jumps in first. But the good news is that gives Spencer and Cody and David more time to think of the correct answer while I'm babbling on. What was the question again, Marisa?
How do you decide? Should you apply for a planning grant or a capital construction grant? Yeah,
so I think, I mean, the relatively straightforward answer is, if you're going for the capital construction grant, I think we should learn from the shovel-ready experience of the Great Recession and various other bailout programs, like you need to be really ready to get into construction if you're going to go after that money. But particularly as you note in the fact sheet, there's a time limit on when this money is available and when it can be spent by. So if you're going for capital construction, you really need to have all your ducks in a line and be ready to start, you know, as soon as you can. So if you're not at that stage, there is always more planning to be done to make sure that you've got everything from your original concept through the early stages of design, so that you are then eligible for whether it's this program or the next program that comes down the line to get into the construction stages. And any of you that work with state DOTs know that many of them already base a lot of their funding decisions on whether projects are shovel ready, whether they're ready for construction. And so take your cue from that sort of level of readiness measure as to whether you're going to likely succeed for a construction grant.
Can I ask a follow-up, just because this is also in the Q&A? And we have a really mixed crew. We have school districts, we have NPOs, we have public health agents, we have elected officials, we have all kinds of people on here. So can you define, what does it mean for a project to be shovel ready?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'm going to piggyback on Andy, and I think point everybody into a much broader horizon of what's eligible, right? So that's a big change for RCN, right? So typically planners and engineers, us here, right, would kind of help you decide whether you should go for a planning grant or a construction grant. In the case of RCN, if you're doing design and engineering plans, right, they can be covered by either side. But I think what's really key in this program is that planning grants under RCN, you can do so much more than what is typically professional planning, right, for a project, right? So you can do lots of community involvement. You can do lots and lots of assessment of burdens, of environmental burdens on communities, right? So if a transportation facility is creating lots of air pollution or noise or flooding issues, right, in your community, you can apply for a planning grant. If you want to do community building, right, if you want to investigate equity issues in your community, you can apply for a planning grant. So I think for many that I suspect that for many that are here on the call today, right, you should really look hard at the planning grant and apply for that, because it's going to give you all those tools to get your project closer to being shovel ready, right? And to answer that question, right, what is a shovel ready project? That's a fuzzy question, right? The DOT will take projects that are in various states of readiness, right? But the more shovel ready it is, the better your chances are if you're going for the construction grant, right? So what it typically means is that you have at least advanced your project through the DOT design process, right? So if you had a project that you had an engineering designing, but it was not through the DOT process, right? You have to come back and talk to your state DOT and USDOT and maybe take that project through the DOT process, right? So your project, if you weren't going through DOT before, it's not as shovel ready, right? But if you have a project that maybe has developed 30% design plans through DOT and doesn't have a lot of funding to finish design and doesn't have any funding for construction, right? That's a prime candidate for a construction grant, right? So hopefully that kind of covers the distinction for folks.
Yeah, yep. Thank you. Thanks so much. I also just want to specifically call out that people in the chat in the Q&A were asking if NAE, Neighborhood Access and Equity, funds planning, or only RCP. And I just want to clarify that both can cover planning. And so I'm curious, Cody, could you reflect a little bit about why your community chose to pursue a planning grant instead of a capital construction grant?
Sure. Really, it's mainly just because we're at the very beginning stages. And so when we've, talked around, various entities and whatnot, we've realized that, we need to start at the basics of like a traffic study of looking at that very specific facility. And then how does this affect the regional aspect of it? And looking at, urban planning of like discussing about how redevelopment can happen and what kind of context that takes into that. So we've looked into things like establishing a land trust that can you receive the land from the DOT if this happens, which there's no guarantee that that'll happen either. But we've really got a lot of things that have got to be figured out before we could even go towards the construction grants on this. Environmental and everything else beyond that. But we're really trying to set the stages of being able to prove out what we need to prove out, specifically around traffic. That's kind of the big thing with just about every city. And the state DOT has pushed back really hard against us, saying that they don't think that this is a feasible idea, which is why we end up applying separate from the state DOT and even our local MPO, is because we just weren't on the same page on that at all. And so, eventually, if it's of note of if anybody wants to know some more of the ins and outs of that, I can talk about why we decided to apply separate from DOT and MPO and how we were actually successful, even though they applied too, and we were selected over them, which is pretty rare. So.
Thanks, Cody. And one thing I want to there's still a lot of questions coming in about planning and shovel readiness. And so one of the things that I want to contribute, just having attended the USDOT webinar about the distinction between planning and capital construction, is that, and what does it mean to be shovel ready? For capital construction, you need to have already done all the feasibility assessments, all of your engineering specifications and cost estimates, all of your environmental impact review. That all has to be done. Which, if you have done that, awesome, apply for a construction project. And one of the really unique things about the planning grant, I think Spencer touched on this, is that it will fund the community engagement and more robust planning than professional planning, but it will also fund that professional planning. So oftentimes it's hard to use federal money to do that feasibility assessment and engineering studies, and this planning just really does cover the gamut. So I want to pivot now. I want to talk about how you demonstrate alignment with some of the merit criteria that are in the NOFO, and then I also want to specifically talk about housing. So I'm going to ask a general question for all of you, and then I have some really targeted questions for David because of the importance of the connection to housing. So I'm curious how, like for Cody, how your application did this, and then for Spencer and Andy, like generally either applications you've worked on or how you would advise. So how did your application meaningfully incorporate the USDOT and administration's goals and things that are in the merit criteria, like alignment with climate change and sustainability, equity and justice 40, housing supply, safety, workforce development, job quality and wealth creation, and if applicable, rural and tribal communities? And I know that's a really long question, so I'm going to pop that in the chat.
Yeah,
I don't have the ability to do that, but putting it in the host and panelists one. So curious how you demonstrated alignment with these merit criteria and USDOT goals.
Yeah, I'll try to be really brief. I mean, we just literally made a list, and as we were writing the grant application, we're checking these boxes. I mean, because that is really how they're grading it, is they're going to look through that and say, did you address this, this, and this? And even outside of that too, is you've got to make sure if you're applying, you've got to make sure that your margins are correct and every other detail that is very specific to those types of grants, because if you don't use the correct margins, it doesn't matter how good your application is, it's going to get tossed out. So those are things that you've got to be really mindful about. And we did engage with a specific grant writer who had done thousands and thousands of these. And so they helped walk us through that. I mean, it cost us about $5,000 to do that. But I mean, it was worthwhile because she was able to flag a lot of things that we had missed and just how to better address some of those issues.
Thanks so much. Yeah, Spencer, Andy.
Go on, you go first this time, mate.
Okay. So yeah, we spent a lot of time going through each of those items, right? And even in trying to select the project, right? To make sure that the right boundaries of the project are what you're going for. So many times it might be, in case of trails, we do lots of trails, right? So somebody might be wishing to do all the trails in the community, right? Or a really long trail system. And we start seeing that, there might be some issues with some segments that have acquisition right-of-way issues, right? Or might have environmental issues. And then on the other hand, some segments might have environmental benefits, right? So trail segment might be contributing to helping, incorporating green stormwater infrastructure, right? Might help manage some flooding in a community, right? So it might, a specific trail segment or greenway or so forth, bicycle facility might help really connect more of the community and really help a denser, a greater portion of the population shift from driving to walking and biking, right? And that's how you start hitting those climate change sustainability goals. On the equity side of things, right? We are really good in two things, right? We're really good at looking at all the GIS data, right? All the nitty gritty to figure out, right, where are the disadvantaged communities that are most going to benefit from the project. And many times the project that is in those disadvantaged communities is a step ahead, and even more so now with RCN. And they've streamlined, you can do it yourself, right? So you don't have to hire expensive consultants to do that analysis anymore. So those are just some of the tips, right, to kind of address those items. And if you are in one of those disadvantaged communities, right, you might not even need the match, the typical 20% match. So that's really, like, every community should be going for it, right, and really pursuing this opportunity.
Thanks so much for reflecting on using those merit criteria to even select your project, rather than trying to shoehorn your pet project into this NOFO, into this funding opportunity, really looking at where in our community would best align with these goals and pursuing that accordingly. I'd love to ask a specific housing question. So David, really appreciate you taking some time to be here. So the grant application, I think many of us on this call know that there's a complicated and important relationship between housing and transportation. And this funding opportunity really is trying to address that relationship. So the grant application asks applicants to think through how their proposed project will affect housing and access. And I'm curious what you think applicants should consider in regards to how a Reconnecting Communities and Neighborhoods grant could affect access to housing.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think it starts at, thinking about the purpose of the Reconnected Communities grant program, right? It was designed to help remedy communities that were broken up due to highways and due to transportation literally going through these communities. And right now we have a different type of displacement pressure. So we have communities that are now not able to stay in their community because of rising rents, loss of affordable housing, ban on tenants with housing choicing vouchers, source of income discrimination, and then poor tenant and eviction protections. And so I think, when folks are thinking about getting their applications ready, they want to think about, okay, how do we currently have a housing plan that includes, transportation, and does our transportation plan include housing? And so some of the things that, folks should be considering is like, rezoning for higher residential density to accommodate greater demand near transit stations. Another thing is like including, local inclusionary zoning programs that ensure that new residential developments are, stimulated by the planned, any new transit stations but making sure that they include units that are affordable and units that are available to low-income households. And then the last thing I would think is seeing if a state or local jurisdiction within their qualified action plan for their low-income housing tax credit program, do they have processes of building that a new affordable housing near transit stations and near places where it is more transit friendly for low-income communities?
That's great. And I think probably for folks who aren't as steeped in transportation policy, can you make some recommendations of who are the kinds of partners or agencies that they might reach out to that have the kind of knowledge that you're talking about?
Yeah, so you definitely want to try to reach out to your local, if you're in more of a major city, your local PHA, your public housing authority, or you're just your neighborhood. If you're not in a major city, but more of a suburbia or rural area, just your either your state housing provider or your just local neighborhood housing provider to see if they have a housing plan or a transit plan, and then see how you can think about incorporating, the things in your application with that housing plan, or trying to even encourage your elected or local officials or just the local housing officials to adopt new housing plans that adopt more transit-friendly policies, especially again for low-income households. We've seen this administration very much have an emphasis on building more affordable housing. So they have talked about building more affordable housing when it comes to not only transit-oriented housing, but the White House released a blueprint on tenant bill of rights that talks about preserving affordable housing. So not just building new affordable housing, but how do we preserve the affordable housing that we have now, and how can transit and transit-aligned plans help with the preserving of affordable housing? So I do think just trying to find your local housing authority, your local PHA, would be great. Be great starting points, but also just if you are in a more rural area, I think just looking at your state housing plan. Every state has something called a qualified action plan for their low-income housing tax credit program that talks, and it should talk about where are we building more affordable housing, and then trying to relate the two to your application if you can.
Awesome. Thanks so much. That's really helpful. And one of the things that you mentioned was talking about inclusionary zoning and rezoning and displacement policies. And one of the things that I just want to flag is that these are eligible activities under the planning grants. And so really, really just want to emphasize the broadness of what is an eligible activity in the planning portions of these grants. I want to ask one more specific housing question, and then I'm going to shift back to a general question and then open it up to the 5 dozen questions that are in here. So for David on housing, and this one also addresses, I know we have a lot of questions in here about the regional partnership challenge. So we know that the notice of funding opportunity specifically states, and as you mentioned, the administration is really trying to ensure affordable housing and reducing displacement. And one of the things that the notice of funding opportunity says is that they are going to evaluate community policies to reduce regional displacement pressures. And this is especially in the regional partnership challenge grants. So I'm curious if you can, for this group, define what regional displacement pressures are and talk about what are some of those policies that evaluators might be looking for.
Yeah, so some of the regional displacement pressures, and again, this is not an exhaustive list, but could be rising rents, the loss of affordable housing that has not been preserved, and then again, talking about whether a region has a ban on tenants with housing choice vouchers. Do they have source of income discrimination laws? And then again, kind of eviction. Is there eviction protections within your regional plan? Because all those have are factors into regional displacement pressures, and so those are some of the things that can be remedied, hopefully by the program.
Thanks. That is so helpful. And I think for those of us who aren't in housing but recognize how important it is in this grant opportunity, we really appreciate you shedding some light on what some of those policies evaluators might be looking for. So I want to zoom back out to generally applying for this grant. Can you all talk about the local match requirements? So we recognize that there are different match requirements for this funding opportunity. The Reconnecting program requires a 20% match for planning. It requires up to 50% on construction. But neighborhood access and equity, while it has a 20% local match, projects in disadvantaged or underserved communities do not require a local match. So I just really want to flag that there's a way to do this entirely with federal money. But I'm curious if any of you can reflect on how do you make the local match? How do you find that 20% for if it's required, or that 50% for capital construction? And we certainly have a lot of questions in the Q&A box about this too. So any tips or ideas for local match would be really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to take just a quick comment to that. So for us in Tulsa, we are doing it pretty much, our local match is coming from in-kind donations, or what they might call a soft match. And so when we're hosting like community open houses and things like that, like there's a group of us as volunteers, and so we can count that as an hourly rate. If the facility for the meeting is donated, then that goes back to our match. And so we've gone through that, and basically through various volunteers, meeting spaces, I'm donating an economic development study to it. You know, there's a lot of ways that you can get to that match without having to go out and necessarily raise money, or trying to get like an MPO or city government to match it. So we're pretty much doing this completely grassroots. It's being self-funded at the moment. You know, we've had several big family foundations in Tulsa approach us that they would like to help us with it as well. So the, you know, nonprofit community is obviously an option too. But I mean, you can really you'd be surprised at how much money you can get from just like volunteer hours and in-kind donations. So yeah.
Thanks, that's really helpful. Andy.
I would say for the folks who are not deep in the transportation world or aren't used to dealing with these kinds of projects, don't worry. Every federal program for transportation funding usually comes with a matching requirement, and so local agencies are used to finding the matching funds for these programs. So don't become too obsessed with finding the match. If it's a good project that your local governments and the community supports, you're going to find money in city, county, regional budgets that you can match, whether it's bond issue money or lottery funds or tobacco settlement. Like there's money in communities for the most part to match these kinds of projects, and people are used to finding them. So absolutely be creative, but don't feel like I mean, 100% credit to you all, Cody, for self-financing this, but like this isn't a bake sale type program, or sure as hell shouldn't be. There is money in transportation budgets and housing budgets and a variety of different budgets to match these kinds of federal transportation funds. Federal money still accounts for something less than a quarter to a third of all the money that's spent on transportation nationwide. So this is not an unusual or difficult. Let me rephrase that. It's not an unusual situation to face. Yes, it can still be challenging or difficult to pull off, but it's very doable.
Great, thanks. So we have a lot of questions in the Q&A box, and I invite you to keep pulling them in. We will be sending out a follow-up, and I can commit to answering as many of these as possible that we don't get to today. But so panel, are we ready for some popcorn Q&A? We have a question. So now we're shifting to all of your questions, everyone. So thank you. So can anybody share what is the time commitment and level of effort to submit an application? And what would be your first step besides getting that UEI number? What would you recommend as a first step for somebody? Time commitment, level of effort, first step.
So first step, I think for RCN now is really go into the valideval.com, right? It's the new link, right? For us consultants, we usually go and read the whole notice of funding availability, right? All the little fine print that tells you all about it, right? And the one for this, for RCN, has some tables there that summarize things, make it a little bit easier. And you can hear to all these webinars that Marisa mentioned earlier, right? But I think the first thing is really go to that validateval.com. It's where you're going to do the application, and just scroll down that website and see what's required, right? So that basically shows you what you're going to need to pull together to get an application in, and really see how, you know, the vision for your plan or for your effort or for your construction fits those, and go from there.
So one of my colleagues told me that they submitted an application from start to finish for the safe streets and roadways for all, different program, but a not totally dissimilar process, in a week, and that they would not exactly recommend that timeline, and give yourself much longer than that if you can. You want, particularly if you're doing anything complex, if you've got a lot of partners involved, you want to build in time not only for developing the narrative, the compelling story, doing the research, putting the pieces together, but also exactly what Cody was talking about, making sure your paragraphs line up and that the margins are correct. Like that stuff takes time, so build in time for that. But it's also something that if you've got a really good project and can tell a really compelling story and can get that across, you can do it in a, again, you know, I'm not recommending a week, but like if you really suddenly wake up one morning and think, holy smokes, this is a brilliant project, this is exactly the program for it, then go for it and get the application in. It can be done relatively quickly, but we're not talking about that. We've got a couple of months. I would encourage you to use all of that time to create a perfectly polished application.
And I would also just say, I think, you know, community engagement in this process, like what Cody's group is doing, is just huge as well. So if you have the opportunity to do that direct community engagement, I think that's because it helps that tell that narrative, it tells that story. And so I think that's also just a huge step in the process to try to do as much community engagement as possible.
Great. So somebody is asking about planning grants and feeling like, how do they demonstrate, how do they tell a compelling story when they haven't yet done the planning? And particularly if they're going to apply for a community engagement process, how do they explain what they're going to do or what they need the funding for when they haven't yet done that engagement or planning?
Describe, oh, David, go.
No, you go in. No, I was just gonna say one thing that you can just think about, even if you haven't done this process, but if you know, and I'm thinking of communities like in New Orleans and Houston, if you know the historical facts, right? That, you know, I've had a highway go through my community, I've had this, you know, I think you want to start there, but, you know, I do think that the historical perspective is still a good one to take. So if you know that you've had, you know, transit interrupt in you know, your community, I do think that is just something to kind of generally take in mind. But go ahead, Andy.
I was going to say essentially the same thing. Like the application for a community planning grant should highlight the problem and the issues, not the solution you've already figured out necessarily. If you have, and you've got the planning process that you can document that says, and here's what the community says we should do about it, then by all means put that in there. But part of this program is to create the capacity within the community to have the conversation, to figure out how to put those housing policy pieces in place that the transportation world has ignored for so long. Like that, this is the opportunity to do that, and thank God for it. So so I would say you don't have to have all of the solutions. You actually want to use and trust the planning process to come up with the final solutions that you're going to use to solve the issues. But at this point, you would be just identifying the issues that you need to resolve.
Yeah, and I would say case studies are important too. Like if you really want to just know, how do we get from start to finish. You can look at a city like Rochester that's done it, or Milwaukee, and some of these other cities that have done it. I mean, we used a lot of case studies as good examples of how and what we need to do.
Thanks, that's really helpful. So this is a very specific question, and I don't know if you know the answer. So if you don't, it's okay, but let's ask it. So how important is it for a project to be aligned with a statewide long-range plan or the state transportation improvement plan, the TIP, in order to be considered for the RCN program? And if you don't know, we can share a link to the FAQ in the NOFO, but if you know.
I'll get started and then Andy and everybody jump in, right? So if you're going for a construction grant, like it has to be aligned, right? So you have to get it, like that's the goal usually, right? If you're doing a plan or even preliminary engineering, you know, some conceptual design, stuff like that. That's the goal. You're trying to prove that your project is going to be good enough and that it should be included in that statewide or even your community's capital improvement program, right? So for capital construction, definitely, right? For planning, especially because you have so many options, it doesn't have to be aligned, right, to begin with, right? So you're starting, you're maybe ringing the bell, right, to get folks' attention, right? That there is something there that maybe folks at the regional level or state level haven't been paying attention to, right? So if you're going for a planning grant, don't worry too much about it.
Let me ask you a follow-up on that, Spencer. So Transportation Improvement Program, which is the sort of work program for the next 3 years that states and localities have, those can be amended, right? So, I mean, again, if you know, if it ideally, yes, and at some point your project will have to be in that document in order for it to move forward, but it doesn't have to be in it the moment you start the application. Is that fair?
Correct. So we can go into a whole nitty-gritty discussion. It varies state by state, right? How their process is for putting a project on the state tip. But yeah, that's the goal usually, right? That you want to amend the tip and get your project on.
Great, thanks. So somebody is asking if they hire a consultant to assist in writing a grant application for an RCN planning study, are they precluded from working on the project itself? Or could a consultant that develops or collaborates on the application work on the project itself? Go ahead, Spencer.
That sounds like a question for a consultant. But yeah, typically if it's a design or construction project, right, it has to be put out to bid. So even if the consultant helps you during the grant application, they'll still have to compete for it. So yeah.
Thanks. Great. So another question, I know we're really tight on time, so we're going to try for like 2 more really fast questions. So I'm curious, we know that federal grants can be, a nonprofit or a local government needs to have the capacity to be able to fulfill the grant. And so I'm curious if any of you can reflect on what USDOT might look for in an application to reassure them that an applicant is ready. And then on the flip side, what might they view as like a red flag or a warning sign that suggests that an applicant might not have the capacity to manage this grant if awarded?
So I'll start and then everybody jump in, right? I think some of the red flags when DOT reviews it is just, you know, looking at the community. Has it received DOT grants in the past? Have they delivered, right? So if you're on the nonprofit side, you know, it might be, or in a community organization, it might be tough for you to find out, right? But if you're municipal government on MPO, you kind of know, right, that you got a grant maybe 5 years ago and it's still, you know, out there and the project hasn't been delivered, right? And DOT won't like that. So that's a red flag. But yeah, I think for planning grants, especially, on the capacity side, that's where partnerships are important, right? So your organization and any organization these days, right, whether it's nonprofit or government, is taxed, right? Like, everybody's trying to hire more people and get more stuff done. And it's really tough to build up your staff. So the more you can demonstrate, right, that you've successfully delivered projects in the past and they have really good staff in place to manage the projects. And sometimes you ask your partners to help you manage it, right? Sometimes the state DOT, I'm in North Carolina now, and CDOT is very active in helping communities, small communities, urban and rural, manage their transportation grants, right? So maybe that's a factor, right? If you get your MPO and DOT to help manage it, that's a plus.
Right. Because we just have 2 minutes left and there are still 60 questions. I want to ask you all if you can give your #1 tip or action step that you would recommend for people who are interested in pursuing this. And while you think about that, I will also just say that we are going to send out a fact sheet. We're going to send out a link to webinars, and I will commit to writing a blog post that answers as many of the questions that we didn't get to as possible and summarizes the amazing insight and wisdom from this panel. And with that, I'm going to put Andy on the spot. What's your #1 tip or action step for people to move forward?
Yeah, #1 tip is tell your story. Don't tell anyone else's story. Don't tell something you think is going to fit the criteria. Well, tell something that fits the criteria, but make sure the story you tell and the narrative you present is authentic. It's yours, because your story is undeniable. What's going on in your community is something only you can describe, and make it yours. Don't try to fit in. Make yourself stand out and solve the unique special issue that you're trying to solve in your community.
Awesome, thanks. Can I popcorn it over to you, Cody?
Sure. I would just say, like, especially coming from a nonprofit side or outside of a government entity, is do the community engagement first, particularly around organizations that are stakeholders in that specific neighborhood you're looking at, and just general political leaders statewide, your DOT, everything. Even if they tell you no or they refuse to meet with you, you're building a list as you're going through, because you've got to be able to tell that story. Like, hey, if we're not applying with our state DOT or our local MPO, why aren't you? And why are you a better fit to do this than them? And we were able to make that case because our state DOT didn't want to. They were like, if we're getting this planning dollars, we're going to do it in 30 years. And that was not appealing to USDOT. So, be able to tell those stories and critique these other entities if they're not on board with you. That's my best advice.
Awesome, thanks. David.
Yeah, Andy kind of took mine a little bit, but if you have any, if your area has any regional displacement, pressures that they're trying to alleviate, I would highlight those, highlight, anything that your regions do to try to keep and preserve affordable housing. And then the second thing is, even if your area, your region is not, you're in a state that doesn't do that, I think still, again, tell your story, like Andy said, and I think it still be key and crucial to hopefully a positive application.
Thanks, Spencer.
I think my tip is really building up on what everybody just said, right? Follow your vision and engage partners, right? So whether it's a complete street, whether it's tearing down a highway, whether it's doing a plan for how to connect neighborhoods that are disconnected or polluted or whatever, right? Follow your vision, take it to everybody who's willing to listen and build up your partnerships. And that's how you're going to get it to the finish line. Yep.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And I want to say, on behalf of the Transportation Equity Caucus, we are so excited to see this federal funding that is specifically focused on repairing transportation inequities and building community connectivity in communities that have not been connected before. So again, I want to really, really drive home the point that there's $3 billion for transportation equity projects, for building community connectivity, engaging your community, doing this robust planning, and it's not going to be available next year. So we hope that this was helpful for you. As I mentioned, we will send out a number of resources, we'll try to make our own FAQ from what you all have asked. And even if this feels intimidating or daunting, engage your partners, find stakeholders. This has the potential to be really transformational, and really, really hope that you will consider pursuing these funds. With that, I want to thank Spencer, Andy, Cody, David so much, and thank you, Axel Santana and Policy Link and the entire Transportation Equity Caucus. Thanks to the League of American Bicyclists and NRDC for co-planning this. Thanks everyone for sticking with us. We appreciate you. Have a great day and pursue these funds. They can make a difference in your community. Take care, everyone.